Every memory ingrained in my brain, every experience crystallized in my soul, and every sensation that had ever run through my body rapidly charged towards their obliteration at my command. Most don't accept the risk that is death, but to me, the true reward would be well worth turning a blind eye to such minute possible losses. I found myself stunned gazing upon the six smooth teal pillars rising from the almost silver marble tiled floor. Behind them, a highly polished stand 2 meters tall presented a shiny dagger with a black handle and a light blue blade sitting atop a bright red cushion. I took a step forward, dirt flying off of my boots staining the marble tiled floor. Looking up at the ceiling, I saw a grand chandelier with many red crystal like shards hanging from it. For a moment, I felt as if I shouldn't have been there. My rugged clothes that spelled poverty in all capital letters had dropped a breadcrumb trail of dirt throughout the hallway. My stroll halted just before reaching the neon red stand. This is my chance. If I were to turn around now, I'd live the rest of my sorry life working for some kind of hard labor. I thought, a wide smirk forming on my face. Let's make sure that doesn't. The floor below me slowly lowered about a centimeter. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as my eyes jolted to the floor, then back to the dagger. It was the oldest treasure guarding trick in the book. I snagged the dagger and jumped off of what I now knew was a pressure plate. Booking it to the other side of the hallway, I witnessed a grand creature materialize before me. The monster's rough skin was light brown, and it had all the same limbs a human would, with no face or really any distinguishable features other than limbs. The creature charged forward. Each step it took could be heard ringing out throughout the hallway. Its slightly darker brown feet caused wide cracks in the marble tiling below. Since its stature was so large, I believed that I might be able to slide underneath it if I didn't hint that I was going to beforehand. Only a few meters away from collision, the creature pulled back its left arm, ready to decimate my tiny body. I jumped forward on my chest and slid right underneath the creature. It ended up punching the ground where I was about a second ago, creating a dust explosion as the tile shattered into a million pieces from the sheer force of the attack. If that tile had been me, I shuddered at the thought of my little meatbag of a body being obliterated. My leather jacket now even dirtier than before, I ran as fast as I could to the other end of what was likely the longest hallway I had ever been in. I didn't make it very far before I heard, or rather felt, the footsteps of the monster bolting behind me. Leaving footprint-shaped dents in the floor, the monster charged forward and would reach me in a matter of seconds. With shaky hands, I took one last look at the blade that I so wished I could escape with, when something peculiar caught my eye. The blade was about twice as long as it had been when it was resting on the stand at the other end of the hallway. With a mostly uneducated guess, I thought that I could possibly control the dagger's ability to extend. It wasn't uncommon for valuable artifacts to have powerful abilities tied to them. Coming to a halt, I turned towards the monster and pointed the dagger at it, praying that something would happen. I found myself simultaneously disappointed and terrified. How could I have believed that I, of all people, would make it to fame? I thought to myself. I spent about a second imagining the faces of the villagers lighting up at the sight of me, the children pointing, the parents smiling and nodding. The dagger's blade exploded forward, piercing the chest of the oncoming monster. Many large cracks appeared around the impact point, as if the monster was made of glass. Grasping for the blade, the monster found that it had returned to its normal size, and was more than far from its reach. More importantly, not able to be snapped in half by its immeasurable strength. Now that the pierced chest was exposed, green powder began to fall through it, developing a pile on the floor below. The monster snapped back to reality and once again charged in my direction. I will not be denied my destiny because of some pottery filled with green dust, I shouted. Despite the impending collision, I managed to once again extend the blade with great speed towards the monster. This time the end of my dagger entered the head of my opponent, causing it to come to an abrupt halt. Falling to its knees, the creature's head started to fall behind it, but it swiftly snapped back to its natural position, and as if it had eyes, it stared directly at me. Leaning forward, it grabbed a marble tile out of the floor and threw it like a frisbee. Though the tile moved extremely fast through the air, the monster's movements were highly predictable. Falling to the floor, I heard the tile whoosh above me and collide with one of the hallway's smooth steel pillars. A piece of the ceiling fell, and as if copying it, the monster collapsed into the space where the tile used to be. Standing up, I looked at the green-stained dagger in my hands. I lifted the blade into the air and shouted incomprehensible cries of victory. This artifact was nothing like I'd ever seen before. On a lucky day, I would find some piece of clothing that would barely sell for enough to buy a loaf of bread. I got into this kind of career in hope of finding something truly special and being known by many for it. While one man's trash is another treasure, I found that some things are just trash in all cases. No one would desperately want to purchase anything I had found, so on occasion, I would have to throw it away, along with my dignity as a treasure hunter. This artifact was different. No one would laugh or spit in my face when I offered it to them. They'd be lucky to see it, let alone be allowed to buy it. Of course, I didn't know for sure that it was actually worth anything, but I assumed that it had to be of some value considering the grand hall that it lay inside of and the creature that had been guarding it. My father desperately wanted me to become a lumberjack like him, and it was still a respectable profession. Beginning my walk to the other end of the hallway, a small dust cloud rose at my feet. While this may have been everything I wanted, I knew it would cause great conflict between me and my father. He had never trusted me to keep myself safe while treasure hunting, and I was sure he would be even more worried if I got deeper into it. I gazed at the blade for what felt like an hour, but was more likely only a few seconds. No one knew who my father was. Clearly, he had done something wrong then. It was at that pivotal moment, scanning the brightly colored dagger resting in my hands, that I knew I had not only escaped death, but dragged my esteemed and long awaited reward along with me. Dashing through the pristine wood door, I entered a dull waiting room where a tall but by no means skinny man with greasy black hair stood next to a steel door with the word Douglas Maverick engraved on it. The man wore a black tuxedo that appeared to have been put on sloppily. Seeing that I was in a hurry, the man did his best sloth impression while looking towards me. "You're not getting in, Felix," said the man, expecting that to be the end of our encounter. "But I've got something really good this time," I said, with just a little bit of desperation escaping through my voice. I pulled out the dagger and held it up for the man to see. "You're really gonna make me waste my time on some silly dagger that you could have just bought on the market?" asked the man. I took a quick look at his feet and caught him slightly tiptoeing, as if looking taller was going to get me to leave. "You know it's the real deal because I wouldn't be able to afford to buy a dagger," I said, my voice speeding up. "Please, give it a chance. I promise this will be worth your time." The man begrudgingly turned to his left and slowly made his way to another steel door, this time with Try Library engraved on it. He tested about 5 different keys on the lock before finally finding one that fit. It just so happened to be the only red one he had. At this point, I realized that he didn't care much about wasting his time if he could waste mine as well. I stepped into a dim room with countless great cabinets in view. The man opened up one in a row that was next to a sign that clearly read Middle Class Records. "I don't think it'll be in there," I added as the man looked at the table of contents of a particularly thick book. "Well, if it's from the lower class, you have no business being here," said the man with a blank expression plastered on his face. "Actually, I think it would be listed in the upper class section," I said as I gestured towards a sign that read just that. The man frowned intensely and his posture worsened quite a bit. Standing up, he moved with a painfully slow walk and made his way to the furthest aisle of cabinets. He grabbed a book titled Blades of the Hero and found his way to the table of contents. His eyes rapidly glazed over the words before he turned the page. "If I can't find anything in here, you're going to get kicked out on sight next time," he said with a slight grin. The grin quickly faded as his eyes halted on the center of the page. I stood over him as he repeatedly looked at my knife in the back of the page. Straining my eyes, I managed to read. "The reach spike dagger has a gray handle with a light blue blade attached to it. Can be found on page 256. With his abnormally large fingers, the man hastily turned to page 256. There it was. Half the page was taken up by a replica of a painting of my dagger. It was clearly the exact same, and the man would have a very hard time denying it. Defiantly sliding a bookmark into the page, the man made a sort of grunt, implying I should follow him. Knocking on the steel door, the man yelled, "Got something important you're gonna want to see." The door opened to reveal a man bearing slick-back brown hair, wearing a tuxedo with an orange tie and a top hat, swiftly stepped out. I instantly recognized him as Douglas Maverick. The name was engraved on the door. He was known for commanding many of the top treasure hunters, and so, even not in being a treasure hunter himself, he had quite a bit of fame to his name. "What do you have for me, Hunter?" asked Douglas, masking his eyes with a pair of glasses with bright red lenses. The man, apparently named Hunter, sort of gestured towards me and my dagger. "Ah, do you have a rare artifact for me to see?" "Yeah, I had to fight some crazy strong monster for it," I said, holding out the knife. Douglas's eyes widened a bit as he inspected it. He snapped with his thumb and middle finger, prompting Hunter to hand over the book. Hastily opening the page with the bookmark sticking out, Douglas excitedly remarked, "You've gotten your hands on something very special here." He cautiously looked up at me and asked, "May I invite you into my office for a quick chat?" "Yeah, totally," I replied. This is it, I thought. Not only was I in the presence of Douglas Maverick, but he seemed to be excited to be in the presence of me, or at least my dagger. Following into the office, Hunter let out a sigh and leaned on the wall. Though I wasn't particularly fond of him, it was nice to finally know his name. The office was lined with expensive-looking paintings and framed artifacts. Douglas fell back into an unusually comfortable-looking chair at his desk and motioned for me to sit in an average-looking chair a few feet away. Clearing a pile of transparent pyramid-shaped objects from his desk and starting to peel a neon glowing orange, Douglas asked, "Can I see that blade again?" I placed the dagger on the desk and noticed Douglas forming a small smirk. Leisurely holding up the book in one hand and flipping to the page with the bookmark, he said, The materials they used to make some of their weapons were truly exquisite. We still don't know where they got them. That's fine, though, because it makes artifacts like these all the more valuable. His smile widened a bit as he began reinspecting the page, continuing to peel the strange orange with his free hand. Yep, that confirms it. They did in fact make this thing with their mystery materials. Look at you, he said, lifting his eyes from the page. Where do we go from here? I asked, my hands slightly shaking. For most treasure hunters, I just buy their artifact off of them, and if it's a particularly valuable one, I might get a news story made for them, but it usually doesn't go very far. The particularly strong smell of citrus emanating from the orange pierced my nose. However, I might be willing to give you a different option, Douglas said, his eyebrows raising slightly. What might that be? I asked, very curious. Though I would pay a lot for this dagger, it might be better if you used it to get more artifacts, he replied. He picked up the dagger and lightly rubbed his finger along it, saying, If I'm not incorrect, you would have had to fight some kind of guardian in order to get your hands on something like this. You did mention something like that, yes? Yeah, it was a big, faceless, and super strong humanoid thing, I said, recalling the fight I had and how cool of a story it would be to tell. Perfect. That shows you do not freeze in the face of danger. That's what a famous treasure hunter needs to be successful, said Douglas. Speaking slightly faster, he added, A great deal of bravery and a strong weapon would make artifact hunting a cakewalk for you. I thought about the famous treasure hunters I had always heard about. Many of them wielded a weapon they found on their adventures. I realized this must have been because the more valuable artifacts were commonly guarded by some creature. Douglas lifted 2 fingers, holding an orange slice between them before starting his proposal. If you agree to work for me, I will register you as one of my official treasure hunters so you can sell all your finds to me, and I will have all your great adventures written about and published. This was a deal I could not turn down. It was everything I had dreamed about. I had always wanted to be a treasure hunter despite my mother doing everything she could to dissuade me. I believed she knew it was very difficult to be successful as one, so she didn't want me getting my hopes up. Not that any of that mattered at the moment. My opportunity had arrived, and I wouldn't let anything stop me from taking it. I agree, I said. With a grin on his face, Douglas asked for a name. Felix Terrell, I replied. Though his eyes widened for only a moment, he started aggressively writing in a sort of notebook. Douglas pronounced, Well, it's official, Felix. As long as you don't disappoint, I see a lot of fame, glory, and money in your future. Slow knocking on the door caused me to abruptly stand up, which brought my teeth and tongue together in a rather painful way. Flinching, I made my way through my dad's old log cabin, desperately trying to reach the door. With a deep breath and a fast-pounding heart, I twisted the rusty doorknob to see a slender but tall man with an expressionless look on his face. Felix Terrell? Alerted delivery? Asked the man. That's me, I replied. The man handed me a single paper with all the recent news handwritten on it. I rubbed the paper a bit and could tell it was much higher quality than the normal paper used for news that was handed out in the town square. The man closed the door in my face, blocking my view of the dim forest outside. While the delivery wasn't cheap, I was desperate to get the news as soon as I could. The front side of the paper relayed information about a famous treasure hunter finding some super valuable artifact, the opening of a new bakery in Redtown, and a couple other high-priority stories. My hands shaking, I turned to the back of the paper. A short, triumphant laugh escaped my mouth as I saw at the top of the page, New treasure hunter recruited under the offices of Douglas Maverick. Douglas had indeed kept his side of the deal, which meant I had had my first taste of publicity. Of course, no one knew what I looked like, but the article did go a little more in depth with my name and how I had defeated a monster in order to get a valuable dagger. Folding the paper in half, I waltzed into my father's bedroom, where he would have recently woken up. Entering the room, I saw my father's bearded face turn in my direction. He was sitting up in his bed, stroking our orange tabby cat. Since my father and this cat seemed to share a similar personality, my mother had named him Fred after her husband, my father. Sharing the same name, my father always seemed to want to be the one to feed Fred and generally do whatever needed to be done to take care of him. With a wide grin on his face, my father asked, "What did you have for breakfast? I hope you ate some eggs I harvested yesterday." Sitting up in his bed, his dark yellow and black checkered tunic became clearly visible. It wasn't unusual for him to just wear his work clothes to bed. "No, I haven't had breakfast yet," I replied, hoping my father wouldn't start to lecture me on the subject. Unfortunately, that's just what he intended to do, as he responded with, "Your body needs more protein. The eggs have been particularly large lately. It would be a shame to pass up an opportunity to really catch up on your protein intake." Trying desperately to stop the rant early, I held up an unfolded paper saying, "Look, I'll eat the eggs, but first I have to show you something." My father's grin faded slightly as he realized what he was looking at. Normally he cared not for the affairs of Redtown, so he wasn't particularly stoked to see their news. "What do you have to show me regarding the Redtown news?" he asked, particularly puzzled. I turned the page to the back and moved right next to my father's bed. Since my story was right at the top, it only took a few seconds before I witnessed my father's facial expression grow even more confused. His face stopped at a somewhat worried look. My father turned to me and asked, "This new job of yours, what are you planning to do with it?" Realizing he was not as enthused as I had hoped, I pulled the page away and explained, "I just want to get some extra money to repair our cabin. This stuff pays a lot, you know." My father let out a loud sigh and said, "I know you're an adult now and you can make your own choices, but please be extra careful with this and don't get your hopes up about it becoming a career." His fist clenched slightly as he continued with, "I only say that because I love you, and because it's better to live out a normal life than to lose it trying to make it better." "I know, Dad," I replied. "I just wanted to keep our cabin alive." I lied. My father stared at me solemnly, almost like he knew that it was for myself. I left the bedroom and headed for the front door again. I grabbed a large leather bag before leaving without having any breakfast. Slowly walking along the pebble path from the cabin into the thick forest, I smelled the pine tree's familiar scent. Somewhere ahead of me was Redtown. The people of Redtown would soon know about me, even if it was only in the back of their heads nearing wherever forgotten memories go. It was progress. I knew my father cared about me, but this was the opportunity of a lifetime. A branch snapped under my feet. During my childhood, he used to look up to the great treasure hunters with me, saying that they brought great wealth and reputation to Redtown. Eventually, his views started to align with that of my mother's. He realized that the wealth wasn't doing anything for us, as we were still struggling to get enough to eat at the time. By the time my father started to look down on the treasure hunters, my mother convinced him we should move into the woods, where it was easier to be a lumberjack. I stopped to observe the bright green leaves above me, the sunlight creeping through them, occasionally lighting up the dark ground below. I never gave up on the treasure hunters. While my father had been waiting for me to adopt the family lumber career, I had been desperately trying to make treasure hunting work. Though I had clearly succeeded, he wouldn't accept defeat. I started walking again, this time with a slightly increased pace. The forest zoomed by as I sped down the trail. The next thing I knew, I was looking down at Redtown from the top of a high hill. Near the center, I spotted the 3-story tall building painted red, known as Douglas Maverick's offices. "This, my friend, is the best bakery in town," said Douglas with an air of confidence in his voice. "The new one that opened yesterday only sells the cheapest of breads. They don't even try to make cakes." With a short laugh, he put a few brown loaves of bread in a bag, readjusted his top hat, and turned towards me. I smiled despite not having any strong opinions about bakeries. Douglas had said he would give me some advice before I went out treasure hunting. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant when he began speaking firmly. "For most of my life, there have been 2 bakeries. Down the street is the Flour House. They have been around since long before my own birth. The bread wasn't great, but it was the only option if you wanted any before this place opened." Douglas turned to the 3 large and brightly colored cakes sitting on display next to the window. "The owner of this bakery we are currently standing in was a small-time treasure hunter who had found himself a recipe that was once used in Tri-City. He had found the recipe for cake. Investing all his savings into a piece of land and some starting ingredients, he tried to start this bakery. His whole family and nearly all of his friends told him that starting a bakery was a terrible idea. There was already one in town, so it was very risky to try and compete with it. They told him it would be risk-free to expand the family business of selling pottery." Douglas loosely laid his hand next to a particularly large cake and blankly stared out the window through his red glasses. "The owner eventually realized that he couldn't pass up the great opportunity he had been given. As he started this bakery, the cakes carried him to great success, while his family's business struggled to compete with the new pottery distribution company." Douglas smirked. "It's too bad they don't have an orange-flavored cake," said Douglas, chuckling lightly. Turning towards me, once again, Douglas finished with, "I wish you the best of luck in your treasure hunting today. I'm expecting great things from you." He slowly walked towards the double wooden bakery doors as I gave him a sort of farewell wave. As he got to the door, he held it open for a young woman with long brown hair wearing a dark green dress that I instantly recognized. It was quite apparent that she did as well when she saw me. As her face lit up, she walked up to me and asked, "Felix Terrell?" I'm surprised to see you now, of all times. Tilting her head to the right, she continued with, I saw that you were just hired as a big-time treasure hunter. Yeah, I always told you I was destined for it, I said jokingly. She bit her lip and said, Yes, I guess you did. Are you sure it'll be worth it? I mean, treasure hunting is a very dangerous job. Letting out a small chuckle, I replied, I know, but I've already defeated a crazy strong monster. She shifted her weight to the left and said, That sounds really dangerous. Please tell me you're doing whatever you can to stay safe. Making a couple exaggerated hand gestures, I explained, At one point I slid under the monster and it punched the spot I'd just been, making almost an explosion out of the floor tiles. With her mouth slightly open, she worriedly exclaimed, That's terrible! Leaning her head back slightly, she continued, What would your parents do if you had died? Your mother especially, since she had given you so many warnings. With a sharp inhale, I replied, The risk is worth the reward, and by the way, my mom's been dead for 3 years. She gasped quietly as her eyes shot to the floor. I'll see you around, she said so fast that it was hard to understand. Walking past me, she sighed and slowly rested her forehead against her right hand. Goodbye, Jamie, I said coldly as I made my way to the double door. Even my childhood friend didn't want me to claim this great opportunity. As I left the bakery, I searched the leather bag until I clenched my fist around the handle of my dagger. They'll all see soon enough. I'll repair my parents' old log cabin, and then I'll appear on nearly every news article. I'll be recognized in the streets by all that pass me by, I thought, a grin visibly forming on my mouth. The Tri-City ruins were only a couple hours away. I felt my soul being pulled towards them. Fame and success were on the horizon, and with the help of Douglas Maverick, they would be mine before I knew it. I stood on the edge of the first district in Tri-City. Behind me in the district were countless poorly made homes that had been effectively destroyed. The homes of the poor usually didn't do so well against the test of time. It was also usually not a very good idea to try to search the rubble for artifacts, since they're typically not even close to being worth the trouble. I took a step forward, entering the middle-class district. The dirt path quickly turned to what was once black pavement. Many of the buildings were still intact, but the looming threat of monsters inside had warded off most hunters. At some point, the people of Tri-City found a way to summon monsters whose sole purpose was to protect valuable belongings. In the lower class district, you could pretty much guarantee you wouldn't come across any of these monsters, which makes you imagine that it must have been costly to summon them. The middle class was a completely different story, however. While monsters protecting valuables still wasn't super common, you could definitely find them if you looked in the right places, or the wrong places if you don't want your limbs scattered in all directions. I searched two medium-sized houses, both bearing next to nothing of note. Neither had any sort of protection, which should have clued me into the fact that they were completely barren of anything worth more than basic furniture that I most definitely wasn't going to take back to Red Town. A wide, brightly colored building caught my eye as I strolled through the street. The many broken windows left glass shards poking out of the ground all around it. I knew that the vast majority of buildings in Tri-City, especially those above the lower class, tended to have their front door locked, either implying that the people of Tri-City were highly paranoid considering they had monsters guarding their homes, or they knew something bad was going to happen. Realizing this house happened to be a generally large one, and that it had significantly more exterior design, it was more likely to bear fruit. Crawling through a window that had probably been shattered for many years, I found myself surprised at my surroundings. A grand piano sat in the middle of a large room with very little decoration around it. The piano, the window, and the two fancy wooden doors were the only things worth noting. Making my way forward, I felt my heartbeat increase drastically. I swiftly looked at the floor to see, just in front of my feet, was a thin, barely visible white line crossing from the piano to the wall to my right. My instinct had been correct to be cautious about this strangely empty room. Though summoning monsters seemed to be very expensive, what was still expensive but less so was traps. Many homes were trapped in ways that would be considered insane if you were still trying to live there. A great example of that is a tripwire that was right in front of me. I backed up to the window much more carefully than when I was walking away from it. A monster I could fight, but traps I would have to outsmart. Unfortunately, that wasn't my strong suit. It may not have been a good idea, but if I did get through a bunch of traps, it could make a very exciting story. Just so I knew what I was dealing with, I raised the dagger from the window and tried to extend the blade. At first, it only extended about a meter, but after some heavy concentration and thoughts about how everything would be over if it didn't work, the blade slowly glided across the room to the tripwire. The instant the blade's tip met the wire, the piano in the middle of the room launched itself towards the wall to my right, causing a loud thud as it ripped a hole in the wood. I wish I was as creative as the owners of this place were, I said, smirking. After pulling my dagger out of the pile of wood that was once the piano, I opened the fancy wooden door to the next room. Bracing myself for some massive boulder to crush me, I prepared to leap backwards. Fortunately, nothing happened, so with great caution, I was able to enter a slightly larger entrance room with a boarded up front door. Those boards clearly didn't do them any good, but I think they suspected it might not, as per the speeding piano trap. 10 minutes later, I had made it to another fancy wooden door without coming across any more traps. Opening the door to make a relatively large crack, I slid through to see a vertically placed tripwire, waiting patiently for the door to be fully opened. Smiling widely, I slowly made my way through a long hallway. I didn't particularly fancy finding out what that last tripwire might do. Most of the doors in the hallway were so high quality that you might have mistaken the place for an upper-class mansion. However, I noticed that I was approaching a door to my left that stood out among the rest. It bore many dents and scratches that caused it to immediately gain my attention. Squinting at the door, I heard a loud, unmistakable sob. It was followed by light crying, and I knew it was on the other side of the beaten-down door. As I reached the door, I noticed that there was the faint sound of distant cheering. The crying was silenced for a moment, but as the cheering faded, it gradually returned. I wouldn't have this nonsense. I had no idea what was happening, but I did know I wasn't a fan of it. Bursting through the door, I found a single painting framed on the wall in front of me. Noticing that the crying had completely halted, my eyes spun around rapidly looking for traps. Deciding that it was safe, I returned my gaze to the painting on the wall. I saw a thin man devouring a massive banquet bearing many tiers. The man looked as if he could die of starvation at any time, despite the fact that there were many empty plates lying next to him on the table. Some had even fallen onto the floor below and shattered at the man's feet. Despite the stream of tears escaping his eyes, he appeared determined. The golden-hued frame the painting was in suggested that this might very well be an artifact worth keeping. Half an hour later, I had successfully carved the painting out of the wall to find that it had not been trapped whatsoever. Though this agitated me slightly, I wasn't sure what I would have done if it had been trapped. Quietly chuckling to myself, I stuffed the painting into my bag and left for the window I had used as an entry point. Trying my best to follow the exact same path I had taken, I found myself very grateful not to have run into any more traps. The middle-class street had become dim as the sun hid behind the massive buildings in the upper-class district ahead. I thought that it might be good to try and get another artifact, but a strange sensation in my gut caused me to turn back. As I walked through the exceptionally thick forest between Redtown and Tri-City, I found myself gazing upon the painting once again. Rather than feeling moved by it, I just felt hungry. Whoever made this is really good at painting food, I said out loud. I stuffed the painting back in my bag and thought, I bet somebody would pay good money to hang this in their restaurant. Sliding through a half-open wooden door, I re-entered the waiting room for Douglas's office. Though I went to sit on one of the particularly fancy-looking couches lining the edge of the room, I noticed Hunter shifting his weight and slightly biting his lip. "Look, Felix, you can just go in," he said, avoiding looking me in the eyes. I pulled out the painting from my bag and made a smirk in his direction, though he didn't notice, since he happened to be very busy staring at the blank wall to his left. With a slow exhale, I placed my hand on the doorknob and began to twist it. "Oh, Felix, come in," said Douglas with an air of urgency. "Is that an artifact you found in Tri-City?" His eyes lingering on the man in the painting. "It is," I replied, reaching towards Douglas's now outstretched hand. I found I had a very small urge to keep the painting. After less than a second of consideration, I realized there was no legitimate reason to do so. "Perfect," exclaimed Douglas, holding out the painting in front of him. He stood up and walked around his desk, saying, "I think I'll hang it until I send out the next artifact shipment." Re-examining the office, I noticed that the vast majority of the artifacts that had been present the previous day were nowhere to be found. Their absence caused the room to appear much more organized and professional, which for whatever reason felt strange. "We just had a record-breakingly large shipment while you were hunting," said Douglas, shifting the painting's position on the wall. "Artifact collection has become one of the most exotic and sought-after hobbies in Shimmer City." In other words, all the rich snobs want to have more shiny garbage than all the other rich snobs. A smirk showed on Douglas's lips as he continued. Keep your eyes out for anything with even a trace of magic. They'll go absolutely berserk for it. Though it could be a while, once I get this shipped out, you'll get your payment, said Douglas. He turned from the now hanging painting to me and continued. You can go ahead and go home now, Felix. I'll make sure to get a fair price for your painting. Shaking his hand, Douglas ushered me out of the office with an almost uncanny smile on his face. He closed the door behind me as a sudden silence fell in the dim room. My interaction with Douglas seemed very rushed, but I was just happy that he seemed to think I had found something worth his time. The room around me continued to be silent, except for the continuous ticking of Hunter's fancy-looking silver watch. Desperately trying to break the eerie quiet, I asked, How much did that watch cost you, Hunter? Sighing, he slowly turned towards me and replied, I didn't buy it. The boss gave it to me years ago. He raised his left arm to inspect the watch and said, The metal part is made of solid silver. He likes to give his employees special gifts when they go the extra mile. With a yawn, he pushed the watch slightly up his arm and under his sleeve. The best treasure hunters are the ones that go home and get some sleep. I don't expect that the boss will want you to sleep in either, so I'd get on it. Though Hunter was finally looking at me, it was with a completely expressionless stare. Are you sure I can't just sleep in one of these fancy chairs? I replied jokingly. No, you cannot, said Hunter, seemingly misunderstanding that I wasn't completely serious. If he understood that I meant it jokingly, he most definitely was not in the mood to deal with it. Until tomorrow, then, I shouted as I turned towards the door. While Hunter was still in view, I saw his eyes roll, which for whatever reason put a smile on my face. The smooth brick road I strolled across definitely seemed at home in Redtown, practically the capital of treasure hunting. Its growth had rapidly accelerated due to the artifacts it exported. The people loved treasure hunters for that. It also helped that the most well-known treasure hunters had many different stories of their adventures. The Spiker was considered to be one of the most valuable and charismatic treasure hunters in Redtown. Back when his career was in its prime, he went on stage and told the extravagant stories of his hunts himself. The theater that he did it in started charging people to come listen, which turned out to be a great move since everyone went anyway. The people who got front row seats told the story of getting their seat in almost the same manner that the Spiker told his stories. A blurry image of Tri-City flashed before my eyes as the buildings got smaller and the road got rougher. Looking down a long street to my left, I could make out a flimsy wood house that was once my own. I used to run down that street, hoping to catch a famous treasure hunter going to Douglas Maverick's offices. Jamie doing her best to follow. Though Jamie wasn't as enthused to see the treasure hunters as I or my friends were, she would always come with me. Unlike Jamie, my friends were always willing to talk about the hunters and discuss which ones would beat each other even if they couldn't go looking for them every morning. On the occasion that they could come with me and we happened to find a treasure hunter, it would always make my day. Depending on who we found, they may have greeted us and told us how cute we were. I passed by the bakery I'd been in earlier that day and thought, I want to be a treasure hunter that everyone looks up to. That will make me happy and satisfied. I stopped in front of the door to Douglas's waiting room. After I went home, I hadn't even seen my father due to how late I got there. Having left early in the morning, he probably didn't even know I'd come at all. I twisted the door handle, and as I slipped inside the room, Hunter gave me a small nod as I approached. Douglas has something special for you today, said Hunter. He wanted you to come in as soon as you got here. Hello, Felix, said Douglas enthusiastically as I sat down. He handed me a copy of the day's news and continued, I managed to get your story on the front side this time. It's only your second major hunt, and the people are already warming up to you. Looking at the paper, I squinted my eyes as they rapidly searched for my story. They landed on a picture of the painting I had found alongside a paragraph about its value, and that I specifically had found it. I know, they haven't even seen your face yet, but an opportunity to get you to the very top of the front side has appeared, said Douglas, taking the paper back and scanning the front side again, he said. Honestly, you could probably get the entire front side to yourself with this. Waiting in anticipation, my eyes darted back to the paper now in Douglas's hands, where I could see that almost half of the front side was taken up by a single story. Before I looked back up at Douglas, I became somewhat distracted by the title of the story. Famous treasure hunter, the Spiral Whip has suddenly decided to retire. I see you've noticed the top story, Felix, said Douglas, leaning forward slightly. He explained, My great friend, the Spiral Whip, was working on a very important project before he retired. I am offering you the opportunity to take it over and complete it. What was the project? I asked urgently. The Spiral Whip had discovered an unbelievably valuable artifact which supposedly held tremendous power. It was split in 3 pieces before being spread throughout Tri-City, a particularly rich snob in Shimmer City with enough money to buy a whole new town wants the full thing as soon as possible, said Douglas. He retrieved a small paper from his desk before saying, "We know where each piece is, but we haven't gotten them yet, since their locations appear to be quite dangerous." Douglas handed me the paper, which turned out to be a map of Tri-City. Observing the map, I noticed 3 red markings that I assumed were where the artifact's split pieces were located. Remembering the previous night, I looked back up at Douglas and said, "I want to do this." A large smile appeared on his face as he stretched his arms above his head. "That's great, Felix," he said, standing up. He continued, "I want to introduce you to someone who will get you up to speed with the situation." A loud knock rang out as Hunter's muffled voice yelled, "The Spiker's here!" "Oh, what perfect timing," said Douglas, gliding over to the door. My hands clenched the desk firmly as I processed what was happening. Of all people to bring me up to speed, it was the Spiker. One of the most famous treasure hunters ever was going to talk to me. If anyone knew how to get people to love you, it was this guy. With a slow inhale, I thought to myself, he's just here to give me some information about the new job. I'm sure he has many important things to do afterwards, so I should try not to be a bother. Opening the steel door, Douglas said, "He accepted, so I will need you to explain everything he needs to know." Turning to the side and smiling at me, Douglas allowed the Spiker to enter the room. When I was a kid, I had managed to catch a glimpse of the Spiker through one of the windows to this very building. I saw that he was a bulky man with flowing red hair, but I wasn't able to see much else at the time. Now that he stood right in front of me, my eyes widened further than I thought possible. The Spiker's now bald head bore multiple massive scars and a hole in his cheek that managed to keep my attention for only a few seconds before I noticed the absence of his left arm. The Spiker blankly stared at me for a strangely long chunk of time before blinking slowly and loudly clearing his throat. With one eye still closed, he said in a deep voice, "I will tell you everything you need to know." Due to the hole in his cheek, it was difficult to make out exactly what he had said. Wearing a black jacket and black pants, the man in front of me seemed to have forgotten where he was. After another strangely long amount of time passed, the Spiker made a sort of gesture with his remaining arm that implied I should follow. Entering the Tri-Library, the Spiker immediately made for an average-looking chair in the corner of the room. I found myself slightly impressed with the chair when it did not immediately snap under the Spiker's substantial weight. Letting out an odd groan, the Spiker started to point toward the upper-class section and slowly said, "Find the small book called The Fruitless Tree." I immediately began searching for the aforementioned book when something peculiar caught my eye. A steel crimson box with 3 chains wrapped around it sat in a slightly open cabinet on the other side of the upper-class section. A lock laid on the floor in front of the cabinet with a key still sticking out of it. I found myself creeping towards the cabinet somewhat against my will. Opening the cabinet further, I was able to get a much better look at the mysterious box. The 3 chains all had their own locks that were still completely bolted down. Starting to fidget with the locks, I was snapped back to reality by the impatient grunt made by the Spiker, still seated, out of sight. After only a few seconds of looking, I found the book titled The Fruitless Tree. Bringing it back to the Spiker, my thoughts returned to that of the crimson box I had suddenly become so interested in. It's none of my business to know what's in there, I silently told myself. Despite it being a completely reasonable thought, I didn't feel very convinced. "Give it here," the Spiker demanded as loudly as one could in his condition. He spent a good minute staring at the cover. As usual, zero emotion was visible on his face whatsoever. Breathing heavily, he finally opened the book and said, "This book contains all the information we know about the Fruitless Tree, otherwise known as the highly valuable artifact we're after." The Spiker interrupted himself with a deafening cough that then continued with, "Each part of the artifact is protected by very powerful guardians that we have yet to defeat." Standing up, he handed me the book, a faint grin finally appearing on his face. He slapped my back with much more force than I would expect from him before saying, "That's what you're here for." A strange noise escaped his mouth that sounded like a chuckle and intense wheezing at the same time. His face darkened as he said, "When you're done with this, just remember that it wouldn't have been possible without my help." His face returned to its natural emotionless state as he finished with, "Read through that book. You're going to officially start the job tomorrow." With Without another word, the spiker made his way to the other end of the room, where he opened the door at a painfully slow speed. I felt a small frown appear on my face as I recounted the events of the past few minutes. The spiker's odd behavior made it very difficult to focus on the task at hand. I wondered why he had told me to remember that this would be impossible without his help. I found this especially confusing when I considered the fact that he really didn't do much of anything helpful. I decided I should return home and see my father so he knew I was okay. I exited the tri-library and asked Hunter, "Do you know if I can bring this home?" His eyes squinted for a second as he inspected the book and honestly replied, "There's not a single other person that needs that book." I took that for a yes and stuffed it into my leather bag. Pure excitement flowed through my veins as I thought about the fame I would receive for doing this. Though I was slightly worried about the fact that the great treasure hunter, the Spiral Whip, couldn't finish it, I just chalked it up to him retiring earlier than expected. Great relief shone on my father's face as he opened the flimsy wooden door. "You can't leave me worrying like that," he said, stepping aside so I could enter. "I'm sorry," I replied. I smelled some kind of meat that had been recently cooked. "Do you mind if I eat some of whatever that is?" An impossibly wide grin grew on my father's bearded face as he rushed into the kitchen. "It took you long enough to realize that you need your protein," he yelled, tipping the entire pan onto a large plate. I didn't complain about getting more than I had bargained for, since I really was quite hungry. My father spent a good half an hour talking about how he was going to work extra hard for a few weeks to try and repair the cabin, cooking more meat and petting Fred all the while. I ignored his possible intentions when mentioning that he would repair the cabin. Even though I had received a great opportunity, I decided it was best to steer clear of the treasure hunting subject with my father. Fortunately, when he realized I wasn't going to try and talk about it around him, he left the whole subject alone as well. When I eventually told my father that I had in fact been home the previous night, he immediately demanded that I go to bed very early. I laughed a bit, but agreed, which seemed to make him happy enough. I slept surprisingly well that night, considering the great excitement I was feeling. I think for my sleep's sake, it was a good thing talking to my father got my mind off all the treasure hunting stuff. Though my father's face seemed a bit darker than normal when I said I had to go, he didn't object in any way. Possibly because I had eaten a particularly large amount of eggs for breakfast. Arriving at Tri-City, I found that the spiker and a slim treasure hunter with long blonde hair that I vaguely recognized were already waiting for me. I found myself slightly impressed that the spiker had managed the hike to get there, but I chalked it up to him still being surprisingly strong. Turning towards me, I noticed the spiker had a gray mechanical arm attached to the left of his torso. A glowing red gem poked out of the shoulder next to a short pipe that would exhale black smoke whenever the arm moved. Though his arm made many loud mechanical purring noises, the other treasure hunter with us whispered to me to not make any mention of it if I could. He did most of the talking as we strolled through the city. I learned his name was Ryan and that he was a generally small-time treasure hunter. The thing that made him special was that he had done extensive research about Tri-City and therefore knew a lot more about it than most. As we paced through the city, he never seemed to show any emotion other than pure excitement. I chalked it up to it being his first real hunt because he would repeatedly tell me every few minutes. Whenever Ryan would state an unrelated fact, even if it was legitimately interesting or useful, the spiker would typically let out a groan showing his displeasure. The spiker was very keen on getting the mission done with and having absolutely no fun with it. I remembered when I was a kid, adults that had heard the spiker's stories would always say that he was such an upbeat and fun individual. I wondered if his gruesome injuries had had anything to do with his loss of any real personality. Either way, I decided that he still had a pretty good life up until then. He had more fame than you can imagine. People would come from outside of Redtown in hopes of even getting a glimpse of him, I thought, almost tripping over a rock I hadn't noticed. The spiker shot an angry glance at me as if tripping would have severely worsened our chances of success. "Alright, boys, this is it," shouted Ryan, quite enthusiastically. We stood in front of a massive double door that was already slightly ajar. Ryan quickly informed us that this was an ancient museum that was once home to some of the most valuable artifacts. Entering the museum, we observed that there were many dead monsters, but nearly no artifacts. "Douglas Maverick and his original team of treasure hunters were the ones who originally raided this place," said Ryan, stepping over an inhumanly large skeleton. He had the only organized treasure hunting group under his belt, and with all the money they gained from the raid, it became quite easy to keep it that way, said Ryan, almost to himself. "It's not as bad as it sounds. Douglas has brought much wealth to Redtown and nearly all treasure hunters who have been willing to work with him." The brightly colored halls reaching out in all directions reminded me of the grand hall that I had found my prized dagger inside of. The entrance to that hall had been obscured by a large boulder that I managed to slip past. I was lucky that the hall itself went underground because it made it very unlikely that anyone had been there before. At least anyone looking for treasure. The floor turned to wood planks as we entered a large dome-shaped room with very little corpses or broken glass. The curved transparent ceiling hanging above us displayed the bright sun staring right down from its center. Ryan cleared his throat and proclaimed, "This room has not been successfully raided yet." His gaze shifted towards me. "That's what we plan to do." Though I felt some pride from this statement, it quickly dissipated as something unusual caught my eye. 3 human bodies laid on the floor. The biggest one had clearly been covered from top to bottom in thick armor, and yet something seemed especially off about him. I leaned over to get a better view, but nearly tripped when I got it. Where the man's head was supposed to be was instead a long dried pool of maroon below various shattered pieces of metal that once formed a helmet.